welcome back to ZCB's Comics Conversations, the only place where you can sell oregano with some seeds and stems to private school kids and not get in trouble. Today, I'm joined by a fantastic creator and inspiration of mine. He's the creator of massively successful titles like Hack Slash, Revival, and Local Man, one of the creative minds behind the Roadie, Grayson, and Tim Seeley's action figure collection. I already said his name, Tim Seeley. Mr. Seeley, how are you today?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. Like I said, I'm a little COVIDed up, but I think I can laser focus, and get this out.
We'll do what we can. I won't keep you too long. So, what is your comics origin story? How did comics enter your life as a kid? And then we can kind of parlay that into how did you get into creating comics?
Yeah. So for me, I was a kid who lived in the country in Wisconsin. So, I have two brothers, and a big part of our childhood was, that there wasn't a lot of kids to play with. It was just us. And so my parents were stuck with trying to entertain us all the time. And so very early on, like we were always watching like any movie, video game, or cartoon, or anything that we could get our hands on. But very early on, I got into Masters of the Universe, which was the He-Man line of toys. Came out when I was 5 years old. And so they came with a little booklet, which was a comic book. And it was basically the first comic book I'd ever seen. And it just blew my mind. I love the toys, but I think the comic was actually like more impactful on me. And I read it till it fell apart. I was always tracing it and, doing all this stuff. Every time I would get a figure, the comic was this huge thing. My brothers and I would, collect them, and we had this whole thing going on with those. And then that led to when we would go out to, my aunt had a cabin in the woods in northern Wisconsin. So she would take us up there, and there was a little camp store, and we were like, oh, it's like the He-Man comics. They had, Spider-Man and stuff like that. It's Hulk. So the He-Man was the gateway, and then that led me to Spider-Man and Hulk and other stuff. And my brothers and I just got obsessed with it. It was just a thing in my house. I have two brothers, and they're 2 years younger than me, then 4 years younger than me. So I was like 6, and my brother Steve was 4, and my brother Brad was was 2, and we were just going through any comics we could, and we were just obsessed with them. So, and then at that point, like, I was like 6, 7 years old. I started getting really into comic stuff. My parents were pretty supportive. They would take us to, there's this a bookstore that had just crates of like used comics and usually kind of old weird stuff, and sometimes inappropriate stuff, but they were just like, hey,
find a random Playboy somewhere.
yeah, it was just like weird 80s indie books, and I don't know, I remember, like stuff like Ninja Turtles would be in there before, I knew what it was. It was just like old weird, and then all the Ninja Turtle knockoff stuff, all the just like weird indie black and white books and horror books and everything, and Vampirella magazines and everything. And but it was a way for my parents to keep us entertained, and they were really supportive about it. And so that was our every, we didn't have a comic shop in my town, so it was all grocery stores. And then we found out there was a comic shop in far off Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so that was like once every 3 months or something, my parents would take us to this Green Bay comic book store. They would go out to eat at Red Lobster. They would give us each $10, and we would go to the dollar or the dime bin, and which used to be a thing, and buy like 100 comics. so it was just it was just like an obsession. And then pretty much from that point forward, I was making comics as well. As soon as I learned how to read with them, and I did kind of learn how to read with comics as well. I was always making them. So we would read, collect, and sit around and make comics. So it was always a thing. When I was 10 years old, I had to do a report for 4th grade about the job I wanted to do when I grew up. So I did mine about comics, and I wrote a letter to Marvel. They sent me a really nice letter back and explained royalties to me, which is
way before you could understand what that meant, I'm sure.
And then it was on Marvel stationery and everything. It was great. It was so nice. And so, that kind of set me on the path. So I've never wanted to do anything different. And I've always wanted to do this, and always made throughout high school. I made comics and self-published stuff. I would like go and hang out at the local print shop and, spend my Burger King paychecks on printing up comics. So it was always a thing. And I never had really another plan, which I now think maybe I should have had a different plan, or at least some other option besides comics, like hedge fund manager, a lawyer, a doctor, something.
Something
Uh,
foolproof,
yeah,
maybe.
but yeah. So, but that's and now I'm 46. And I've been doing this professionally for 21, 22 years, and um, I've been reading comics since I was 5, so 41 years. So yeah, it's been a
Wow.
while.
So it's
It's
been
been
a
a
life of comics. It's you've
life.
known nothing else essentially. It sounds
Right.
like your parents really understood that comics is a great form of literature, getting you guys to read, plus art of engaging with culture in a different way. Much like looking at paintings and looking at the old masters, it's essentially the same principle in studying that.
Yeah, they were great about it. My Both my parents had grown up reading comics. My mom had a bunch of Archie stuff, and my dad had grown up reading Marvel stuff. He didn't have his comics still when we were kids, but my mom did. So I also had Archie comics, Pep, I remember, and Betty Veronica and stuff. So for me, it was just comics for comics. It didn't matter where they came from or what they were about. They were all sort of the same level of interesting. So I think, but that my parents coming from a background of having grown up on them really helped us too, because they knew what they were about, and they knew um, that it would keep us like interested in something other than I think at the time it was the 80s, so everybody was doing video game stuff, and I think we didn't even have a video game system until like the early 90s, because we didn't care. We were just we had
Yeah,
comics and we were good, and also we were poor. That was the other side. But
that is part of it. One of my comics origin stories, I guess, to a certain extent, is I didn't have the money to buy comics all the time, so whatever I could find, I could find, and it forced me to read a bunch of different things. I wasn't
yeah,
beholden to one publisher or one character. I got to experience the wide range of what comics can be, which is funny that you brought up that you didn't care comics for comics because you've written for Image, Dark Horse, you've written for Marvel and DC. Like you've done it
and
all
Archie.
for
Yeah.
seemingly all of it, and Archie. So, which I'm not going to ask you which publisher you enjoyed more, but do you have some titles that stick
It,
out from maybe the early years that from what I could find, I think it's GI Joe's either Bloodlines or Frontlines number 18 was your
yeah,
first credited title. Is that correct?
that I wrote. Yeah, I was drawing my first drawing stuff was I think G.I. Joe 16. I drew that one, and I ended up drawing a lot of stuff for Devil's Due at the time. I ended up on G.I. Joe pretty early, and some others titled, but yeah, that issue of G.I. Joe Frontline was like my first. I mean, there's stuff before that, like independent published stuff for sure. I worked at a company called Dead Dog Entertainment when I lived in Minneapolis for a couple of years, and I did a bunch of horror books with them. I didn't do a great job. I was like 23, but yeah, that GI Joe Frontline was the first sort of credited one. But for a lot of it was when I started at Devil's Due. I was an intern at Marvel Comics when I was in college. So when I was 20, 21, 20, 22, I did an internship at Marvel, and it was like a credited thing. Like I got to go to New York, and I was broke as shit, but I worked at Marvel, and then I had I originally applied to be an art intern, but I didn't get it. I was like, well, shit, I'm not going to get this. But then they called me back and said, would you like to be a story or editor, story editor intern? And so I took that, and I worked on the Spider-Man books in 1999 as an intern when I was 22. So um, that I learned a lot about like how to put stuff together, and how to make comics, which is how I ended up at Devil Do. But I also learned, like I knew what a script looked like, all these stuff that I didn't know because I was a yokel from Wisconsin, that really like made me more confident to do stuff that I originally kind of thought I wouldn't do. I thought I would just draw, but and that's how I ended up with that Frontline book. It's like, yeah, I can write something. I'll figure it out, which is basically how I've done everything. It's just fake it till you make it.
Which is the secret to a lot of people's success because you realize as you get older, nobody really knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And you just got to figure it out. You got to wing it. It's really interesting that you brought up that you're born in the 80s and lived through the 80s. So your first, correct me if I'm wrong, your first full title after Frontlines was G.I. Joe versus Transformers 3 in
Yeah.
2003. Was it daunting to write something that you kind of grew up with? You grew up in the time of the Transformers and G.I. Joe. Is there something familiar about writing something like that, or is it daunting? Is it a little scary because you want to do this injustice?
I mean, in a weird way, I think about this a lot now. Is that I just didn't ever think about that shit when I was in my 20s. Like I would just I was never intimidated. I was just like, yeah, I could do it. Um, which is weird now because I'm much more likely to be intimidated now at 47 or 46, I guess, than I was then. I don't know if it was just kind of like blind ignorance or what, or just youthful arrogance. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I really didn't feel intimidated. Maybe I should have. I think that's, it's something I think of now where I was just excited to have something come out. Like, I would, when I made Hack Slasher, I wrote those books. I would just do it and I'd have a good time and I'd make something and then a month and a half later it would be in shelves and I would just be ecstatic. I just want to know what people thought. Which now I kind of, every time something comes out, I'm kind of like, oh God, which is, is weird. But there was definitely something about being younger and just not giving a shit, I guess, or something. So yeah, I didn't feel intimidated then. I definitely knew to, like I'd grown up on Transformers for sure. I love Transformers. I wasn't a huge G.I. Joe kid. I had a few of those, but I had seen the show and I understood it. I had some of the comics. But I definitely knew to sort of aim myself at the things in G.I. Joe that I would be good at. So when I do G.I. Joe or Transformers, it's always the weird shit. It was always like the monster figures or the Coppola cult or it was, or I don't know, Robot Serpentor. I would always just do things that, were more my speed, which I knew like the realistic military G.I. Joe was not going to be my thing necessarily, which is why G.I. Joe Frontline is a comedy. The issue 18 that I wrote with Mike Norton is a joke. It's a funny comic, which I was like, that I can do. So I didn't try to do things that were kind of outside my wheelhouse too much.
Which is really cool that you bring up that it's a comedy because all of your writing has this delightful sense of humor to it. Even if you're dealing with super dark subject matter, there is this sense of humor. Do you find that in your personal life, when you deal with adversity or you deal with something that's a little heavier, you tend to try to laugh through it? I know obviously a lot of artists put a lot of themselves into their work in terms of how they process things. Would you say that's similar?
Yeah, probably. I mean, and much to my chagrin of everyone around me, I guess. But but yeah, I guess I've always taken the stance that life is funny. I mean, like even when you're in sort of the worst of it, sometimes it's just so ridiculous that you can't help but laugh. So, yeah, I mean, it's actually not very helpful in superhero comics to do funny stuff because people don't really take those things. They take them very seriously. So it maybe worked against me, but I can't help it. I have to be able to make a joke. And, in most everything I do is at least somewhat a satire for sure. Hack Slash is obviously, though it is a slasher comic, it's also a satire slasher. And Local Man is a satire of superheroes, 90s superheroes, which I love, but I think I make fun of the things I like the most, probably.
Which feels reverent. It doesn't feel like you're shitting on it. It feels like you genuinely care because it's out of good faith. It's not like you're saying like, oh, this thing sucks. Like I genuinely like this thing. I engage with this thing. I'm a fan of this thing. You essentially earn the right to poke fun at it.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, certainly there are things that we make fun of in other titles that they're not things I love. But like I do a lot of, and maybe it's to like real world politics and stuff. I mean, Local Man has that in it. Hack Slash has that in it. Revival, Lobo, Superman, like all that stuff has. I just can't help it. Like, but that's always, to me, that's the most interesting stuff. Is sort of like when I was a kid and the stuff I liked in science fiction was the stuff that was sort of an extrapolation of something now. Player piano and that one, Ray Bradbury, all that sort
Fahrenheit
of stuff.
451.
Thank you. that kind of stuff, like where they were extrapolating on something and sort of doing a satire, but it's also kind of a warning. That's kind of a big part of most of my stuff too. That satirical aspect, and also, kind of a critique, I guess.
Moving on to some of your creator-owned stuff, Hack Slash is one of my favorites that you've written. Even though I am personally a big fan of pretty much everything you've written. There is the idea of like the final girl fighting back, and that seems to be a trope now. It doesn't really seem like it was in the early 2000s, at least from my perspective as someone looking with hindsight. I was born in 97, so I'm only 26, turning 27. So like, as much as I try to study older media and things that happened before I was born, or even when I was young, I can't get all of it. Did you feel like you were maybe onto something on the cutting edge a little bit when you came up with the idea for Hack Slash? Because it does seem like a fresh take in 2003 on something that wouldn't have been told. And it certainly wouldn't have been told in like large scale media like film and TV, but it would have been told in something like comics.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had, antecedents. We had stuff that inspired us. And obviously I grew up on B movies and stuff because, like I said, my dad was a big movie buff. So, especially like VHS, sort of direct to video horror stuff and all that kind of thing.
But that's on Tubi.
Yeah, all that kind of good stuff that now is just streaming junk that's fun to watch. But that stuff was always there. I guess the thing that we brought to it was that it was putting it all into one world, I guess. The sort of like the slasher hunter idea. I think that was certainly us. That was certainly me and Steph, and I did that probably first. But I wasn't influenced by it because I hadn't seen it. I didn't have cable, but obviously Buffy beat us out. Buffy has a similar idea. It's the cheerleader now fights the monsters instead of the monsters chasing the cheerleader. And so there was stuff. Maybe it was sort of like bubbling underneath, but there's lots of stuff that comes after that. Definitely, I can see this sort of Hack Slash influence on it a little bit. What's the Juliet Starling? What's the that one video game? And then we
Bubblegum Chainsaw.
Oh yeah, that one, and stuff obviously comes after. You can see, like, we were probably ahead of it, and if you were a fan of that stuff, you definitely, you knew about our book and had your own take on it. So, yeah. So I mean, we're probably like sort of riding the zeitgeist to some degree, and because we're in comics, we're able to do things a little faster. I do think, the stuff that we brought to it was also, I think the thing I'm most proud of about it was that there was this perception at the time that like women didn't really read comics, and that if they did, it would be something like Sandman or something, or manga. But I was like absolutely 100% convinced that you could make a book for like goth girls and they would read it, and I was right. And that's the thing I'm the most proud of.
You succeeded by a large margin. You proved that 100% right.
Yes, and that I'm really proud of, because I think there was this perception that like women only wanted something kind of fancy and fantasy and sensitive, and I was like, no, they don't. And we were right. I mean, I think that's one of the best parts of Hack Slash was like, that first year we came up with it, sitting at a con and having, all these sort of like Suicide Girls type, which was the thing of that era.
Which you crossed over with eventually.
Eventually to cross over with, coming up and getting books signed. And that's how it happened. Right? I mean, that's like, because I met all those girls because of the book. But yeah, so I think that's the thing we were most ahead on. The recognizing there was this audience that, and then there was also this like really ravenous horror fan audience. I knew that they were there. And 30 Days a Night had come out just before us. Walking Dead, I think, was within a couple months. So we were sort of on the riding this wave of like a resurgence in horror comics, and a reminder, I think, which is something I'd been forgotten, that, horror was sort of one of the original most successful genres in comics, and it was due for a big comeback.
Yeah, 100%. And I think having within a couple years before Hack Slash came out, digital horror like 28 Days Later and the Blair Witch Project, and those things being pretty massive phenomenon, that totally accelerated what hack slash could be. And one of the cool things I really love about hack slash is that it's essentially at a heart like a revenge tale. Were there any specific revenge tales used as inspiration?
I think a big thing, sort of vibe wise, and what we wanted to feel like. I mean, it was kind of hard for me not to come from, the indie goth comics that I had grown up like with The Crow, which was a huge one. It's a massive influence on hack slash. Obviously, we eventually crossed over that too. But there was a book in the '80s called Faust by David Quinn and Tim Vigil. And there was this sort of like grouping of kind of gothy punk, splatterpunk books that came out around that time that I loved, and I they were kind of grimy and gritty and often pretty offensive, and I really liked a lot of that sort of stuff. So I think at least the vibe and the kind of the tone, I think a lot comes from those books, because I think The Crow most of all. Because I really liked about The Crow was that it was a revenge story, but it didn't skip on the emotion. He wasn't just angry; he was also heartbroken, and he was, and it was such a revelation to read that comic. I was like 16, I think, 15 or 16 when I got it, and perfect time for a gothy revenge story, and that I think that's probably the biggest specific influence on how we approached it.
I can 100% see that. I think what's really great too about male-centered horror, like The Crow, where it gives a lot of depth to the character in a very similar way that like Al Ewing's Immortal Hulk did for the Hulk. It took what was already established and really added this depth of character to it, and you can see that all throughout hack slash. I think hack slash is one of those titles that I think most people look at and go, "Damn, I wish I created that." They're a little jealous. They wish they'd probably beaten you to the punch a little bit.
I heard that a lot then. I don't hear it that much now, but
well, if there's a hack slash fan in this world, it's me, and I will ride with it for sure.
But the other side of this is actually when we came out with it for that era, like when you would put out an Image book or a Greater One book or an any indie book, if it was like well received and if it sold well, it was kind of like an application to work at Marvel and DC in a way, and then they would come to you with jobs. And so lots of my friends who were coming out with books at the same time, Kirkman being a big one, and some of my other people that I was working with, we would have books that are, obviously Walking Dead became way more successful over time, but at the time it was about the same. They would give those things that I wouldn't, and I was always like, why? And I realized, like, the people who were hired at the time, they were like kind of embarrassed by it because it looked exploitive, and it had a girl who was, sometimes you saw her underwear and all this sort of stuff. And there was like this real conservative sort of approach. So it didn't really lead to a lot of, I mean, it was successful and it paid for a lot of stuff, which was great. But it wasn't like a thing that got me gigs, which is interesting. So that's why I did Revival to some degree. I was like, well, fuck you, then I'll do a serious horror thing. And then, and it won't be exploitive and stuff, and it worked. Like it's ridiculous, but people, it always fascinated me. There's this sort of dislike of anything sexual and stuff in comics to the degree like where it doesn't register as a success critically, generally speaking, no matter what you do. It's sort of like, yeah, that was good, but it was trashy. Like it can't be that was good and trashy. It's but it's certainly the case with us that it took it took me probably 4 years to figure out if I wanted to do other stuff in comics, I had to do something that they would take seriously, and Revival was that.
And Revival is also just a fantastic series. I think you definitely can feel the 2010s Image feel, and I mean that in a major complimentary way, because I think what it did well was it didn't copy the success, but it was lumped in with the success of all these other Image books at the time, and it helped solidify it as a serious book, not just by the dude who wrote the exploitative, hack slash, trashy comic, but as a serious creator. You're no longer viewed in the same light as you were. And I think Revival is also one of those things that I do want to see adapted. I'm not a huge proponent of adapting every single comic ever, but Revival is definitely one that deserves like an HBO limited series or something along those lines.
We have tried. We have definitely been trying for a long time. So let's hope that actually happens. But yeah, it was the timing on it was fantastic because that era of Image books. I mean, I wish we were still in that era because if you had something that was well received, like retailers would get behind it. And yeah, we were able to do 48 issues of Revival, with the Chew crossover, which seems like a pipe dream today to pull off that long for creating your own book. So, yeah, I feel very fortunate, and we got lucky and hit at the right time and made a book that, yeah, I mean, it was a horror book, but without like the underpants, I guess. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. It's the thing that you can see, like, I guess, the new True Detective Night Country. Like, you could see that same setting is Revival to a certain extent. And I think it's really beautiful to see now. Again, with hindsight, I was a little too young to read Revival when it came out. So having read it after it had finished and after it had been some time, looking back on it now, there's a reverence now for the same thing Revival was doing. And I think as a creator, that must feel pretty good to know that your work is essentially being appreciated, whether it's not being appreciated by name.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think I've always had the thing where, and this is how you can do things in comics. So you kind of feel something coming and culturally, but you can get it out before anybody because you're faster. So like this sort of like premium cable drama family thing, we were like, well, let's do that in a horror scenario because no one's doing that. And of course now that's a lot of that sort of stuff. But yeah, you can kind of ride the wave, but be at the crest because it takes you 3 months to put something out instead of, 15 to 16 months just to get something started and then film it and all that other shit, So yeah, I'm glad we did Revival. I having made it so contained, I occasionally regret because there's no way to do another one. Like Hackslash, you can just keep making, like they could cross over with all kinds of stuff, and it's limitless. Whereas Revival is sort of by definition limited, which is occasionally a thing I regret that we made it so insular.
Yeah, I can imagine that it also is really hard as someone who's not created anything really, getting towards a ways into a series and going, where am I going? I think it was Robert Kirkman who said with Invincible, he actually didn't mean to end it, but he found himself accidentally writing towards an ending, and so he said, well, I guess we got to end it. Do you find that that's a subconscious worry at all?
Well, Revival, one of the impetuses for making it was that Mike Norton and I had been talking about doing something. He was a huge Lost fan, the TV show Lost. And when he got to the end of Lost, he was just like, and he's not alone, but he was like, what the fuck? They didn't know how to end it. And, that's because that show they didn't know how to end it. They didn't have an ending in mind when they started. They were just...
The writer's strike didn't help at all either.
True. But they, it was a show that was about characters and it was super well done, but it had no plan. They didn't know the mystery, is really what it comes down to. And J.J. Abrams is probably the first person to admit that, he writes things with this mystery box in mind, but sometimes he doesn't know what's in the box. And then the people who view it, read it, or watch it are like, yes, I want to know what's in the box. Like, I don't know. So our plan was, what if we know the ending? Like, what if we have we start this and we have it all figured out. And so then all we do is get there. We take our time, but we know exactly the plan. And that, I think, is why that book holds together, is because we did do it that way. But we had it pretty tightly planned. We had a version where if it needed to, it could have ended in 12 issues. We had a version that if it needed to, it could have ended at 25. And then we had the version that could go till 48. So, and once we sort of on the system of where we were putting up these trades, and they were 6 issues a piece, and that would have been 8 trades or 4 of the big ones. Then we're like, well, let's just keep going with that. So I've never had something so figured out as Revival, but there was also plenty of room in there for side stories, and sometimes a character would kind of take over, and that was okay, because we had the A story sort of for every issue and then we had a B story that could be something else. It was planned from the beginning, and we got there exactly when we said we would.
Which has to feel really satisfying as well.
It was pretty good. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's when you have something like that, I guess the downside of something like Lost or Game of Thrones even, which is that people will love something passionately while they're in it, but then if you don't hit the ending, then there's this sort of like at the end, and people they may love it, but they don't love it like something like that kind of sticks the landing, that they feel satisfied that they got the whole thing. Which where say what you will about the first 3 Star Wars movies, but at the time, people certainly felt like it stuck the landing. And so I'm so glad we got there. If we had got to the end and we just didn't know what the fuck to do, and then we're stuck with something that people kind of went, that would be a bummer. But we planned it in a way that, I've tried to now do on other things, but not Hack Slash, because Hack Slash is not about planning. It's about
no, it's a book that's built on chaos. It's built on spur of the moment, which is one of the things that I really do love about it. It's one of those things that can go indefinitely. And I'm very much an impulsive person. I'm if I make the decision to get a haircut, I'm getting a haircut that day, no questions asked. I'm going.
Yeah.
And that's what I love. That energy is palpable in Hack Slash, and I think it resonates across generations, because even as someone who didn't grow up in the same era of, Hack Slash coming out and being such a big deal. I can look back on it and go, yeah, it still makes sense. Like the feelings still resonate to this day later down the line. And I think it's one of those things that definitely needs to be built on the chaos continually, and it can never slow down.
Well, it ends up being interesting because when we were coming out with monthly books, it's a different sort of thing, because people are surprised. They go to the store and they see it and they're surprised. But now it exists in those hardcover omnibuses, or and there's 6 of them, and it's I have to assume that for now most people read it that way, and they're reading and they're like, holy shit, what the fuck, Chucky's in here? I think that it still works because it's it's basically just demands you buy this big old chunk of book, and then you get some kind of story, and it just takes you through this sort of journey that, even we didn't know what was going to happen when we were doing it. So why would you?
Our time is coming to a close, so I want to kind of wrap up with Local Man and The Roadie kind of combined. So Local Man, I actually posted a TikTok at the time of recording, like an hour before we hopped on, reviewing Local Man, and I think it is my favorite current ongoing series. I love it to death. I think it's so beautiful and poignant, and pretty much every turn. There's a big through line of the Midwest in all of your writings. Because you grew up in the Midwest, it's what it makes total sense. Jack moves back home and he feels shameful, and he feels kind of like he peaked already and he has no clue where he's going. Is that inspired by some time in your life where you felt like, I'm moving back to square one and I need to figure this out? Because he's not defeated. He is down, but he's definitely not out. Is there a point in time where you were there and that served as an inspiration for Jack's story?
Yeah, I mean, so it's more that it's a fear. I've long had this sort of terror that, well, I came out of my small town, Wisconsin, and I told everybody, because I was always the kid publishing the comics, and I was doing that in high school, and I'll always like sort of, and people believed in me, and that's why I took it very seriously. They're like, he's gonna go on and do some stuff. He's gonna go work at Marvel. He's gonna do all these things. He's gonna make stuff. And so, but I told people I would, and so then I went out and I did that stuff, and if I come back to my hometown, they're always like, oh, I hear you might make a movie. Are they going to film Revival here in Wausau? All the things I wish I could do, which probably would be impossible to do. I always kind of felt like if at some point shit went wrong, and I live in Chicago now, and I have lived in Chicago for 20 years. But if I felt like things went wrong and I had to go back to my hometown and be just like, yeah, I couldn't hack it. For some reason, it just really freaks me out. And, it would be like admitting a sort of defeat. And, I know nobody else would care, but it would bother me. But so that sort of dumb fear is definitely what I want to have Jack go through my fear, And I wanted to do it sort of inside that 90s comic world, because to me, that's what I wanted to do. That was I wanted to make my own Savage Dragon or Spawn or Youngblood. And like, that was what I lived in that world, and that's that energy that I want to do. So it kind of made sense to do that story about one of those characters. And him having to go back to, Midwest after having been in Los Angeles. Obviously, I've been living in Chicago for 20 years. That sort of, I could do all those things, and how you would feel, that you used to this life where you have all this access and all this stuff, and now you're in a small town where there's definitely not going to be a good sushi restaurant. Just that kind of story that we want to do. And then the other side of it was that Tony and I both had been through divorces and about the same time, and that really freaky moment where you start over, and you go back to zero, and you're like, holy shit, like I spent years building up something, and now I don't have that house anymore. I don't have that partner. I don't have that life. I lost a bunch of those friends. And financially, I'm taking a big hit here. It feels like you have no grounding. So that we wanted to put that in, like that sort of, I could keep on falling. I think that's the feeling that we wanted to capture. Like, holy shit, I fell, and I could keep going. Like I really could. I could end up on the street where I'm at now. And so, that kind of illusion that you build up a life and that it's going to stay this way forever, it gets shattered when you go through something like that. So we want to put Jack through that. Like, he doesn't even own the things that he thought he created anymore. And so that's kind of where we want to start with him. And the other side of it is sort of, but he keeps trying, even though he probably should just give up because he makes it worse most of the time. A big part of it is he just keeps going.
As a person who failed out of college the first time they went, had to move back home, had to swallow their pride. I mean, I can speak to the fact that it's like nobody around me other than my loved ones like cared. It didn't register to them. No one was thinking about me. But knowing that like my loved ones have to see me at this low point, and like I've been fired from jobs before, and it feels very similar, knowing, man, like this sucks. Like everybody's looking at me as a failure, especially when you're a kid who grows up with a bunch of potential, right? And you have this clear path. And Jack is very much a character who who had and still has a ton of potential. And I think it's really beautiful that he's now in his 30s. He's a grown man. He has lived. He's in his 40s, right? He still has potential, which I think speaks to the indomitable human spirit. Like he can keep moving as we all can. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Jack as a character, in my opinion, is that he keeps moving. He keeps finding a way. He can't do it as Crossjack. Well, fuck it. He's going to be Local Man. And when they write Local Man ruins everything, well, it's going to be on him, but they're going to be calling him by name. And I think that that's a really cool thing. I also see a through line. The Roadie was something that was released for Dark Horse not long before Local Man came out. I'd imagine Local Man probably was already in the publishing process by the time the Roadie finished. You see that, as we talked about, Jack gets knocked down. He kind of peaks early, but he doesn't want to stay down. And then you have a character like Christian Mass in the Roadie who peaked early and tries to get back there, but he doesn't care to change. And then you have Joe D, our protagonist of the Roadie, who he knows what he is. He knows that he's a little past his prime, but that doesn't stop him from progressing. Was there a conscious choice when creating the Roadie and using that kind of dynamic and then seeing it in Local Man? Do you think there was a conscious choice, or do you think that was still a byproduct of just where you were at, that it bleeds through every project and not just this one specific project?
Yeah. I mean, I think I try to do, be okay with the fact that your life infects your stories. I don't think there should be this sort of shame. If something big happens to you and you turn around and tell a story about it, like that's the job, I think. So, the Roadie is, it's largely the event of having a kid. And I'm an old dad. So I wanted to make, because I had a kid at 42, I'm going to be 47 soon. My daughter is 4 and some change. And you know, that sort of having your life drastically change, me find out that someone is going to rely on you is you know, that was a huge thing for me, but it was also something I thought would be interesting to extrapolate for a guy like Joe, who kind of lives in fear of this legacy that he has. And so he didn't want to have a kid. He didn't, his dad told him not to do it. And so kind of live this whole life, and it didn't really go anywhere, but he had his moment in the sun, and he was just kind of like, he was fine with that. But now he's kind of got to bring more energy back to this thing that's going to be really hard. And I think that's like, just that idea that, you know, before my wife had our daughter, like, you know, sitting in bed at night 42 and be like, I'm going to be so tired. How am I going to do this? How am I going to pull this off? I got all this other shit to do. And you just do it. And you're right, you're tired, but you just keep doing it. And that's kind of how I think Joe works too. He's just, something was presented to him and he's like, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. He wasn't excited about it, but he's going to make it work. You know, I liked his character. I also thought it'd be interesting to the guys who are roadies and like the people I knew that sort of did that job or lived that life, like they were always okay with being in the background, because, or they had to have accepted it, right? They had to do it for something else. They had to do it for the love of the music, or they had to do it for, you know, and that I think is a thing with comics. He feels that because you're never going to be like super rich or anything. You have to do it because you love it. Like the only way you stay in this long is if you loved it, and you could accept some shit on the way because of how much you loved it. So I really want to write a character like that, where he, you know, it was really, for him, it was about the music. And even when he loses the music, now it's about his kid.
And comics can be essentially a punk lifestyle. You know, it's core to who you are. I've always said, like, I started collecting comics when I was 9, but I've always loved superheroes as a kid. It's just who I am. When I met my now wife, when I actually moved back home from failing college and we started dating, I told her, yeah, I collect comics, I'm into comics, and she had no frame of reference. She had never seen a comic book movie, she'd never cared. And now, like, she's even learning to love the thing I love a little bit more, and she's seeing that, like, it's so true to me that, like, my kids are gonna love comics too, because when you're true school, you're true school. Like, it's not a phase, it's not a fad. And comics, like you said, is a thing you have to love to stay in. And you can see that from the people who grew old doing comics. Like guys like Jack Kirby, who died making comics, like those are guys that loved it and lived it.
Even if it didn't love them back.
Yeah. Not until much later, admittedly. Yeah. And unfortunately, when we see a bunch of creators, specifically now from the 80s and 90s, as they're getting older and getting health issues, they have to start GoFundMe campaigns. And with the fact that artists and creators aren't paid what they are worth in the comics industry, and there's no correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no union, there's no like pension fund, and like you're just an independent contractor essentially. So it is sad to see. And I think that the good thing is there's a young generation of comic fans who are seeing that, and they're advocating for the rights of creator comics. And creator-owned comics, admittedly, I feel like are at an all-time high. It's easier than ever to kind of create a comic. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all our time. But what are you working on? Plug yourself. Where can we find you? Where can we support you? The floor is yours.
Well, Local Man's still coming out. Local Man and Bad Girls comes out, I believe, in March. And then Local Man 10 follows not too long after that. So if you haven't checked it out, you can try out this one, actually. This trade is out. The first collection. And then the second one rolls out pretty soon. I did a book called Deathstalker for Vault Comics with Jim Terry and Slash from Guns N' Roses and Steve Kostansky from Psycho Goreman. And that comes out in March, I believe, as well. It's a sort of a sequel to the 80s low-budget barbarian fantasy films, which I have a lot of affection for. So that comes out then. Let's see what else do I have. I've got Master Universe Forge of Destiny just finished up, and the trade that comes out pretty soon. And Money Shot, new trade comes out for that pretty soon. And what else I got? I've got
A lot
some,
of irons in the fire is what I'm hearing.
yeah, yes. And then I've got a couple other things that'll get announced, I think, this month. Two DC things and some other associated stuff. So yeah, keeping busy. I'm trying to put as much energy and stuff into Local Man as well, so that it'll be a nice package book that's kind of a perfect. I want it to be like Revival when it's all together, a nice chunk of book, and everybody will get to enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much to my very special guest, Tim Seeley. He is the man. He's an awesome comic book writer, and he's a good hang. If you want to support his current ongoing series, Local Man, single issues are still available at your LCS, and it is currently ongoing. If you want to get collected editions, you can find them at sites like Organic Price Books, In-Stock Trades, and I'm sure your LCS has some as well. If you want to go support me, you can follow me on TikTok at Zach's Comics Box, as well as liking and subscribing. Thanks again. Thanks for dropping in. I'll see you next time.